town. When I was a kid, what I understood about that history was pretty limited. A lot of the businesses in town relied on miners and their families to keep them afloat. There were streets lined with company houses, one after the other, perfectly uniform, and many of the streets still look like that today. My grandfather was a miner in the Princess Colliery. 12 years before I was born, it shut down. As a kid, I heard very little about the miners' way of life. The only coal I would see were the pieces fashioned to the lapel pins we wore in our school choir. It wasn't until I was much older that I started asking questions about my grandfather and his work. I came to learn that he was active in his union. Hearing the story of my grandfather's advocacy for his fellow workers connected two parts of my life I had held separately for so long. More than 75 years after my grandfather first became active in his union, I found my own place in a union. First in university, fighting for education that's affordable and accessible, then as the leader of a national student movement, and now in my professional work in the labor movement, advocating for workers' rights and carrying on the work that people like my grandfather paved the way for. Essentially, unions are a way for workers to unite together to stand up for fairness, safety, and equality. There are millions of union members who are working together every day to achieve great things for themselves and for all workers. For the past decade, I've learned firsthand the power we can harness when we work together. Like coal miners working under treacherous conditions hundreds of kilometers underground, a movement of workers, of neighbors, of allies, are most effective when they band together. It's a primal instinct. It's in our nature. Recently, a friend shared a story that reminded me of the power of a union, but not in the way that you might think. She was talking about geese. Each year, Canadian geese migrate south for the winter. We can all picture them flying in a V shape through the sky. Did you know the weakest of the group flies at the front of the V? That way, if one of the weaker geese gets tired, they all take a break. No one is left behind. This is one of the greatest gifts my work in the labor movement has given me. At our moments of weakness, when we feel the odds are stacked against us, when we're facing an uphill battle and victory seems far out of reach, we can turn to our community to find support and solidarity to carry on. Unions have taught me there's strength in numbers. It's a lesson we've been conditioned to reject in a world so focused on profits and productivity. Our society has become so individualistic. We're told you must pull yourself up by your bootstraps in order to have a better life. It can feel impossible in this culture of competition where we're often pit against one another to imagine that we can build a better world, because we know we can't do it all on our own. But what if we didn't have to? What if we imagined a better world, a more just and equitable world? And what if we committed right now to make that world a reality? Sounds a bit idealistic, doesn't it? Maybe a bit naive? People advocating for change are often labeled that way, but it's been my experience that the only naive people are the ones who don't believe our big ideas are possible. In the 1980s, people thought Roseanne Doyle's big idea was impossible. She fished with her husband in Witless Bay, a fishing community on the southern shore of Newfoundland and Labrador. Up until the 1970s, women were rarely involved in the harvesting side of the fishery, but women's work in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, from care work to food preparation, mending fishing nets, salting fish, and in later years processing it in plants, meant the difference between survival and starvation for many families. For years, if a woman went fishing with her husband, she wasn't eligible for employment insurance benefits, even if she fished every day of the season. Women's work was only considered help and was therefore not valid. This archaic, sexist assumption was keeping thousands of women out of the inshore fishery, and Roseanne Doyle wasn't going to stand for it. Roseanne and the women of the inshore fishery took their fight for equality all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they won. Employment insurance regulations were amended so that women would receive the same benefits as men. While the struggle for equality in this male-dominated industry continues today, women in the 1980s who banded together to challenge the status quo have turned the tide when it comes to representation in the inshore fishery. Today, there are thousands of women working in the inshore fishery, harvesting and processing seafood, and sustaining the economy in many coastal communities. Realizing your power and using it to create change is such an important part of the fight for equity at work. And sometimes it takes a chorus of voices around us to remind us of how powerful we really are. While the fight for workers' rights continues, the nature of work itself is changing significantly. For our parents' generation, most people would spend the majority of their career in the same field, maybe working their way up a ladder over the years. Today, most young workers will have several jobs over the course of their working lives. If you're lucky, they'll be good jobs with decent pay and benefits and opportunities for advancement, but that's not always a guarantee. At one point or another, we've all found ourselves daydreaming about quitting our jobs and chasing our dreams. Maybe you'd pursue your passion for music or art. Maybe you'd become a writer. Maybe you'd open your own bakery and leave your boring, unfulfilling job behind to become your own boss. This is the promise of the gig economy: flexibility, freedom, independence. Sometimes it's romantically referred to as a side hustle, but the reality can be much different. It can mean working multiple jobs in order to make ends meet, with few workplace protections, no benefits, and no job security. For a lot of gig economy workers, precarious work isn't a choice. It's the only option. In November 2020, the Los Angeles Times published the story of Khaled Saeed. Khaled was a driver for a popular ride-hailing app who worked up to 80 hours per week to provide for his family. He'd just taken a break from driving when the stay-at-home orders came into effect. But when his family's expenses began piling up, he had to go back to work in order to make ends meet. Khaled returned home every day with stories of passengers who refused to wear masks. Despite the clear risk to his safety, he felt he had no choice but to continue working. Not long after returning to work, Khaled contracted COVID-19. And in July, he passed away due to complications from the virus. When his family attempted to apply for workers' compensation death benefits, they were denied because the company Khaled worked for, like many app-based companies, considered him to be an independent contractor, not an employee. For gig workers, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the gaping inequality and lack of security inherent in these precarious jobs. Food delivery drivers and Uber drivers were already working in an isolated environment before the pandemic. Their jobs are precarious. They're often short-term. Their boss is an algorithm. For workers who want to organize together to improve their working conditions, these factors make it incredibly difficult to connect and collaborate. It's nearly impossible to compare experiences or build relationships with your colleagues when you might never meet them face-to-face. I've heard organizing a union of gig workers described as being a bit like herding cats, if the cats were also on bicycles, worked irregular hours, and had never met each other. Historically, movements that have fought for social justice, that have succeeded in improving working and living conditions for us all, have been led by unions. And sometimes we take these victories for granted. Equal pay for equal work, child labor laws, sick leave, parental leave, minimum wage, workers' compensation benefits, the weekend. These victories of the labor movement haven't just benefited unionized workers, they benefit us all. They form a safety net for working people that can mean the difference between having to go to work when you're sick or staying home to get well. These benefits would have made a difference for Khaled Saeed and his family. As we look towards economic recovery, we can no longer afford to talk about what we're willing to settle for or replicate the systems we've outgrown. Instead, we should use this moment to imagine the world of our dreams and harness our collective energy, resources, passion, and determination to make it possible. Let's use this moment to improve the status quo for all workers. Whether you're an essential worker in a grocery store struggling to make ends meet on minimum wage, or a freelance graphic designer working contract to contract, or a food delivery driver relying on tips to cover your overhead, I have seen firsthand what a group of people can accomplish when they share a common purpose and work in solidarity towards a common goal. In a time of isolation and social distancing, we have to find connection with each other. We've got to be concerned about one another, about our coworkers, about our neighbors. Sometimes the state of the world feels a bit too close to the plot of a dystopian fiction. But this is not a moment for despair. This is a moment to come together. What kind of world do we want? And how can we work together to make it a reality? To fight for something, people have to be able to imagine it. So take a look around you. Look at the person you're sitting next to. Think of your neighbors and your coworkers, and ask yourself, how much more could we achieve for the common good by standing together rather than standing alone?